Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another Facebook Live. I'm Kevin Ring, president of FAM. We've been doing a lot of different topics that we think are of interest to you, and today we have another one. We're going to focus on Florida, and we're grateful to have two elected representatives join us who are very involved in criminal justice issues and prison oversight. Before we start, I just want to do a housekeeping measure, which is a lot of you who are in our closed Facebook group or you're coming to us for the first time are not aware of the resources that we have on our homepage, which I think you'll find very helpful. And so I'm going to ask Alexis to pull that up. But if you go to fam.org, you should get a pop-up box that will talk about COVID resources. And there at that page are tons of opportunities for you to take action in your state or at the federal level, especially if you're coming to us because you've heard about our efforts to seek federal compassionate release for people. We're trying to find attorneys, pro bono attorneys, to help people work the compassionate release program. Here it comes. So go to this page before you start with us, before you ask any questions, check it out. There's a lot here. Again, state-specific stuff, federal stuff, and you will find it really valuable, I think, given a lot of the questions that we're getting. So, okay. In addition to that, you know, if you are not a member of our closed Facebook group and you have a loved one who is in prison, you can join that. It's Families in Action in Facebook. Right now, I'm going to introduce to you Greg Newbern, FAM's Florida State Director, to introduce our guests. Greg?
Thanks, Kevin. We're certainly privileged and honored to have two of the greatest champions of criminal justice reform and sentencing reform and prison reform in the state of Florida, and certainly in the Florida House of Representatives, Representative Diane Hart and Representative Anna Escamani. Representative Hart, I believe, is 61st district. Is that right?
61st.
That's right. And Rep. Escamani, I know, is 47. So they have been, like I said, two of the greatest champions in the legislature. They have both visited any number of prisons and other facilities. We'll get into that, I'm sure. They're a great sounding board and for ideas in this space. And just wonderful champions. Could not ask for greater champions. And we're so thrilled that they're here to answer some of your questions and share some of their insights and wisdom in this particularly difficult time. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us.
Thanks. And I just want to start by asking both of you, you know, how are you coping with this? How are your families doing with this and this new reality? Because all of our families are going through it. They have a tougher situation, having a loved one behind bars. But this is a difficult time. And so, especially as elected representatives, you know, how are you working with this? And I guess I'll start with Rep. Hart.
Why, thank you. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. This is a most difficult time. I am working with the community on all levels, whether it's about food for just families or if it's about the school lunches for the children. And then, of course, you know that families are calling me, writing me, emailing me, texting me about their loved ones who are in prison. We're getting hundreds of letters from all over the state. Some of you all might know that I've visited more than 55 facilities. So that means I have thousands of cards that have been left at all of these facilities. You know, my heart goes out to those that are incarcerated because they can't go anywhere, you know, and they can't practice any safe distancing and all those things. So my heart is bleeding for them. But for these families out here that are in dire concern as to whether or not their loved ones will make it through this virus or not, that's very, very difficult. I'm grateful to God that my family is doing very well. My children are all okay, my grandchildren. My daughter is playing school teacher every single day with her grandchildren. So, you know, I have much to be grateful for, but it's not quite that way for so many in my district. So I'm doing whatever I can to help my families get by and get through this.
Thank you.
And thank you, Kevin. I echo Representative Hart. It's an honor to be part of this conversation. And thank you so much for inviting both of us to share this digital space with you. Personally, you know, things have been really, really tough for our district. We have been working 24/7 addressing constituent issues ranging from unemployment insurance and trying to get some accountability from the state on the broken unemployment insurance website, supporting our small businesses during this time as well, as many have had to shutter their doors and are not seeing the relief from the state or from the federal government come in fast enough, all the way to supporting our healthcare providers with PPE and ensuring that there's enough testing for every person who needs to get tested. So Florida is unfortunately not meeting the mark on a lot of key issues, and that also is reflected in our lack of transparency. And there's been lack of transparency on a lot of issues, whether it's the number of people who've actually filed a claim in Florida for unemployment insurance and their ability to actually be able to see money in their bank, whether it's from the state or the federal government. Lack of transparency in talking to lawmakers. I know Rep. Hart knows this, but we used to have scheduled calls with the governor's office, and they canceled those about 3 weeks ago. So we have not had a lawmaker call with the governor's staff to be able to share what we're hearing on the ground directly with the governor's office. Lack of transparency on the testing backlog, where the state is not considering testing by private laboratories to be in the backlog of tests that we're waiting for. And then finally, the lack of transparency with our prisons, which I know is part of the conversation today, but we have been asking Department of Corrections, I would say from our team since early March, about what is the department doing to prepare for COVID-19? What are to Hart's point, the social distancing efforts being made? What are you communicating to families? Asking every week for updates. And we both talked about on the House floor as well during the last day of session on March 19th. And we were given the department's press release statement as how they were handling COVID-19.
Right.
So looking forward to this conversation, because I know that for so many families, they are struggling right now. And we've heard from many families of the incarcerated, from those who are incarcerated, about fears around their health and safety, and of course requests of compassionate release, which at this point, not only have we not seen any type of movement on that, but the governor actually made comments that were quite stigmatizing towards the incarcerated during one of his press conferences, which is disheartening for a lot of us who are every day advocating for reform in criminal justice, because the current criminal justice system in Florida is archaic. Mass incarceration is not the solution any day. It's not the solution during COVID-19 either.
Yeah, well, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I appreciate the fact that you did speak to the fact that the governor did say he would not let anybody out. He said that exactly 2 days after I sent him a scathing letter begging for a release on a compassionate release for folk who are terminally ill, or people who already been approved for compassionate releases that for some reason the Commission on Offender Review said no when they went up before them to get that release. So I get this, but the governor and his staff, and I'm wondering even if my new secretary get what we're about to embark upon. This is something that we've never seen before. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation today with you all. And my hope is that I'm sure, I can guarantee you, they are watching this live. They watch everything. If I jump on my page, they immediately get on it. So I know they're watching this today, but I want them to better understand, I will not stop writing the letters. My Congresswoman partnered with me. The Black Caucus has stood with me. All of us are standing in this together, and we're not making any movement. So maybe if the president told him, maybe he might consider it. So let me just see if we can reach out to 45.
Well, let me drill down on some of this. At FAM, when this first came, we thought, we saw all these extraordinary precautions being taken in the outside world. We're closing businesses, we're telling people to stay at home and do all this stuff. And then in prisons, it's like, we're gonna try to get you some soap or some hand sanitizer. So it just did not seem as if we were taking the same extraordinary precautions there. And as it got closer and we realized what the ramifications were, we thought, it's not just about cleanliness and hygiene. We got to do a couple of things. One is there has to be some level of safe decarceration. We're not going to get social distancing to the extent that we have it on the outside, but there have to be releases we can make. Greg has been saying the answer can't be zero. I mean, no one can think the releases can be zero. So one, what can we do there too? And then the second one for our families is some transparency, because they are nervous as can be. They hear about a death. In this recent case, they didn't hear, they heard rumors and then it wasn't confirmed for a week. So every time they hear of a positive result, they're worried what that might mean for their loved ones. So I want to start, maybe we use both of those buckets. One, you mentioned compassion release and whatever. I don't know if you were czar, how you would handle this, but like, what can be done, including with the authority that the state has, to release people who either pose no threat to public safety because they're elderly or infirm or at risk, or at the end of their sentence? What do you think the state could be doing and isn't doing?
Well, many of you all know that I did file a bill to release people, and it was called the inmate treatment bill, which would have allowed our governor to be in a position right now to release our most vulnerable. That's people with all kinds of underlying health conditions, asthma. They have all kinds of lung issues. We have many people with cancer. In fact, we had a gentleman die 2 days ago, and I was heartbroken because we'd asked for a conditional release. The doctor had signed it, the warden signed off, and the Office of Offender Review said no. So in this, all they need to do is take a look at our folk, 69, 70, 80. We have people as old as 90 years old that are still incarcerated in Florida that could not pose a threat to anybody. Many of them are sitting in their cells like zombies. Some of them don't even know they're still in the world. We have families who are saying, if you allow my loved one to come home, we're here to care for them. We're not asking you to let people go who will pose a threat to the community. We're asking for folk who are totally incapable of doing anything. Many of them, other than just lying in their beds, are sitting in a wheelchair. And that's a sad commentary. Now, you could let some people go who are right at the end of their sentence, who have 4 or 5 months. And even if you didn't trust them, stick a band on their leg and let's monitor them until the end of their sentence. But there's got to be something that we can do. But currently, the department and our governor has basically said, I'm not doing anything.
Well, let me just push you on that point. And my guess is if Secretary Inch were here, he'd say, I don't have the authority to do that. Like if your bill passed, yes, but do you think they have authority today to do some of these things?
The secretary doesn't have that power, but the governor certainly has that power. He can stroke a pen and do whatever he like when he wants to. But no, the secretary does not have that power. In fact, he thought he had that power when he left the feds and came to the state. I even had that conversation. He didn't know that he could not sign compassionate releases.
Yeah.
That wasn't a part of his little job title. They didn't tell him. So he didn't know.
Rep. Escamani?
Yeah, I'll add to that too. I mean, the governor has sweeping powers under his executive order authority, especially under a state of emergency. He actually has the ability to suspend statute if it impacts his ability to respond to the emergency. So the governor very much does have authority on these type of issues. It's more the public pressure to make him do something about it. And it's I think it's not just frustrating right now, this moment, but it's frustrating long term. To echo Rep. Hart's point, she filed an incredible bill, House Bill 189, that we all supported, we all rallied behind. Many of our Republican colleagues talk about criminal justice reform. So we see, some popular supporter around this issue within the legislature, and of course, among the greater public. To hear the governor make that comment just last week, I mean, it's very disheartening, not just the emergency we're in today, but the larger conversation on criminal justice reform and trying to really repeal things like mandatory minimums and support efforts of gain time reform and create a public safety structure that prioritizes public health, well-being, and safety over just punishment. And so hearing his remarks was very disheartening just for the long-term battle that we have in front of us on criminal justice reform. But I think during COVID-19, it's the opportunity to point out all the problems, knowing that we got to fix it now, but also let's fix it next session. So I encourage every family member to keep engaged, contact the governor, contact the wardens of your prisons, contact your elected officials, because this is such a incredible moment in our nation's history where all the systematic problems we have pointed out are becoming more and more real. And in particular, healthcare in the prison system has always been subpar, always. And now we're seeing it firsthand at a really extreme moment. But it wasn't something, just now happening. Rep. Hart has been talking about it for a long time. Our office has been, many other lawmakers too, Rep. Valdez, others. So it wasn't like it's new to us.
Greg, I wanted to bring you in on this because Secretary Wetzel, the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections Secretary, said to me that this crisis is exposing systems. And so systems that were ready to handle something like this are going to do a pretty good job. And the systems that weren't, you're going to see fail miserably.
Right.
And I know you've been pushing uphill against what is a broken system, admittedly. The secretary has admitted it.
Right.
And I mean, how do you see this?
Well, I mean, I think that there are obvious structural deficiencies that have come to light, but they had come to light previously. And like Rep. Escamani said, this really just focuses our attention on those structural deficiencies. And whether that's the understaffing problem, which was what Secretary Inch was talking about when he said, you know, we're in crisis, you know, he was focused specifically on understaffing and 12-hour shifts and so on. But that's a problem normally. It's a crisis now, right? I mean, that's the things that are just problems that we are hoping to fix in normal times become potential catastrophes during public health emergencies. And so, you know, it's hard for me to believe that FDC was appropriately prepared for something like this, not just because, you know, they don't know what they're doing over there. It's because, you know, when you have staff shortages, again, it becomes potentially catastrophic. And when we talk about these release mechanisms, the law that say governs conditional medical release, and Rep. Hart sort of referenced it earlier, the eligibility requirements under that statute are just comically narrow, right? I mean, it's terminally ill or permanently incapacitated. It's not just for the chronically ill. There's no release mechanism for elderly people. And these are rules that are written for normal times, right? These are not lifeboat emergency break glass rules.
Right.
And one of the overarching structural deficiencies that I've seen is that we do not have emergency break glass rules in Florida. We have overly rigid, no matter what, you can't touch it rules. And it was really what was so frustrating, because the regular session ended right around the time the full scope of this thing was coming into focus, right? Like, we kind of knew in late February, early March that like something bad was happening. And if you're walking around the Capitol, everyone's kind of like, don't shake my hand, so I don't want to get sick. But, you know, aside from the week that you come back for the budget, all the policy work was done like March 13th or so. And it just hadn't yet reached the point where everyone understood, like, this is really, really bad. And so the regular session ended before the legislature could really take a look and say, okay, what does need to be done if we want to have an emergency break glass or lifeboat type of rules that we don't have right now. So, I mean, I would say it's a missed opportunity, but it really just reflects the underlying structural deficiencies that not only in statute, but also in the department.
Well, I just want to say one thing that Rep. Escamani mentioned is that there has been bipartisan support. So I'm going to give a shout out to Senator Jeff Brandes, who's watching this and just wrote in to let us know that he was watching it. I don't think he disagreed with anything you guys are saying, which I think shows you that there's support for this. Equally discouraged I was about the governor's remarks about not releasing anyone. For the people who are concerned, if there's not going to be releases, and I'm happy to talk about why there should be, but in the absence of that, what is the department doing or should be doing, in your view, to protect people? A lot of the questions we get are about the corrections officers themselves bringing it back and forth into the facilities, not wearing protective gear, and not showing a lot of concern, frankly. I'm sure everyone's fearful. My view on this is the guards and the folks inside who living there should be on the same side on this. They all should want a safe place to live and work. And so, you know, my sense is that we want everyone to be protected. And so my question is, what have you heard that the DOC is doing or could be doing? Because when it comes to testing and things like that, families are very skeptical that the testing is being done. And so when they see the numbers as low as they are, they think it's just because tests haven't happened. And I don't think that's paranoia. I think there's some good reason to believe that. What do you all think about that?
Right. Well, go ahead, Anna. Go ahead, Rep.
Well, I think it's a really, really good question. And it's funny because so many families have emailed us with the advice that is absolutely reasonable and should be implemented. I mean, step one is this PPE for everyone. And I was very frustrated to also hear that the correctional officers would get PPE first and then the incarcerated. And they're doing an effort to get everyone some sort of PPE, not to, you know, have this scale system. And the fact that hand sanitizer is banned in prisons because it's flammable is wild to me as well. When I learned that from DOC early in March, I was very just kind of surprised by that, right? Because this is one of the best ways to prevent COVID-19 is sanitization, and hand sanitizer plays a part in that. And so, you know, I think it's so important that families continue to keep their lawmakers in the loop on the advocacy that they're doing so we can elevate and escalate their voices in the process. I think the first thing that DOC needs to consider doing is, and they should have done this weeks ago, but like I said, is PPE for all the correctional officers and the members of the incarcerated community to make sure that everyone is benefiting from tools to limit their exposure to one another because they can't always social distance. Making sure there's plenty of soap readily available at every location, at every prison, and really ensuring too that any type of sickness that someone might feel, that they're able to go to the medical unit and not face a charge. And that was one of the first asks that we had for DOC early on in this process was we wanted to make sure that DOC didn't charge anyone for medical care. And also when it came to being able to connect with their loved ones, we wanted to ensure that because the physical meetings were suspended with loved ones, that there would be the opportunity for free communication. I do think that the prisons can do a better job about that. I know that credits were secured for JPay, but I am concerned that's not enough. And not every member of the incarcerated community, depending on their sentence, also has access to using JPay the way that others do. And we have heard from families of those on death row, not being able to access some of these same resources as other members of the incarcerated community. And of course, when it comes to just maintaining health and well-being for families, being able to talk to your loved ones is key. And so I would want to see improvement on just that communication to families so that there can be more transparency. And then I'll just add one last point around like report numbers. Tell us who's been tested, tell us which prisons. We need to know everything. And no matter what our secretary says, optics has a huge impact on the greater public. And so you might be saying you're giving us all the facts, but when you hide from it and make information difficult to access, it gives off the impression that you're hiding something. And so many families don't trust the system for valid reasons. So it's hard for us to trust what DOC says when we hear news from the rumor mill before we actually hear it from the officials. And that's not okay.
I want to jump to Rep. Hart, but first I want to say something about the communications. In Congress, in the CARES Act, which was one of the emergency COVID response bills, they passed legislation, they passed a provision that allows people in federal prison to make free phone calls during the course of this pandemic. So again, I think that might have gone to what Greg was saying, which was, you know, you guys were not in session at a time where you really needed to be to do some of these measures. But if the feds can do it, I don't understand why more states can do it. People who are watching, if you go to our website, that's one of the actions you can take. We're part of a petition drive with a number of groups and our great partners at Florida Cares to try to get the state to act on that. I know there's been some credits, but it's not the same. I was going to mention one other thing because this statistic is amazing to me. In Arkansas, people talk about the spread and why testing is so important. When they had the first positive test in an Arkansas state prison, they decided to test everybody in the barracks. They were all asymptomatic, but it turned out that 43 of the 46 tested positive. And so that's how it's spreading in prisons. You don't know it is, and you're not testing. And so I think that's what's really critical. And I think people know that, you know, prisons are going to be the last place you're going to dedicate those resources. And that's what makes families scared. I'm sorry, Rep. Hart, I want to invite you in.
Yeah, well, let me just say this to you. The part of the reason, long before we even began to talk about our facilities, the first week I called and I said, what about hand sanitizer? And they said, well, Rep, they will drink it. So it's a contraband. Yeah. However, I'm talking to their guards, to their officers, and they're saying to me, well, Rep, we're bringing our own hand sanitizer to work. So even though they were telling me the inmates could not have it, the officers were bringing it in. But what was sad for me was, why should your officers have to supply their own hand sanitizer? Why did we not have stations in places where the inmates may not go to use the liquid? Second thing I said, can we have sheets? They said, absolutely. Well, how come your facilities don't know they can have sheets? So then they placed the order to get sanitizing wipes to be used in the various facilities. Now, in all fairness to them, they do give you two free phone calls a week, I'm told. Nobody's called me, so I don't know yet from a facility, but that they do now give them two free phone calls a week. They allow them, I think it's one JPay a week. People have tablets that they're not allowing them sometimes to charge in a timely manner so that they can continue to keep in touch with their relatives. My thing is, when that officer approaches that gate, his temperature needs to be taken. It's not being done all over the state. And they know it, and they know I've already called out the facilities where the officers told me, we're not doing that at my facility. So I sent them a list of that. So I'm sure now those facilities are doing it. But I can tell you, if you're not taking the precaution on the front end, our inmates are not coming and going, only the officers. And then when you tell me we back trace, I have a problem with that, because if you're around 10, that 10 was around another 10, who was around another 10 somewhere on the compound. But you tell me you're back tracing. Well, Rep, immediately we call the health department. They come in, they do a back trace, and then, you know, everything's cool. At Lowell this past week, it was a week ago, because yesterday was 9 days, the entire kitchen staff had to go home to be quarantined because somebody tested positive. Last night, they tell me, Jared tells me from the Department of Corrections, well, did you all know that the CDC has changed it and you no longer have to quarantine 14 days? So because we don't have to do that, we're no longer doing that. So the families were calling and the people from prison saying, it's been 9 days, we're not ready to go back. Well, we need you to go back. So they sent them back. But they say CDC has now changed the law and you're no longer required to remain 14 days. I say err on the side of caution. Stay 14 days and see what happens. But they're not doing that now. So they're going right back to work.
And what are you hearing about things like soap? I mean, like, you know, people don't have access to commissary and stuff. I mean, have you heard about people getting sufficient or adequate?
Well, it depends on where you are. Even, I can tell you, Centurium, our medical provider, they're not even providing their people with adequate soap at some of our facilities. So you can imagine what's happening around the state. I can't speak for all of them because I do call the wardens every time somebody calls me. Of course, they're going to say, oh yeah, Rep, we're making sure they have soap. And I'm saying, no, you don't. I can tell you what dorm it's not in. I'm not telling you who the person is. So there's a lot going on here in Florida. And I thank you all for this because we've got to stay on top of them. They're not telling the whole truth. Anytime I know somebody died before they do, I have a problem.
Yeah, I'll say, you know, we sent a letter to Secretary Inch on March 30th. I was actually looking for that letter earlier, and I thought it was April because 2 weeks, a month, a year, who knows how long time has passed, but it looks like it was March 30th. And we sent that letter. It was one of several we sent to secretaries of correction around the country because it occurred to us fairly early on that besides just release, which is the obvious option here, that families were going to be just really thirsty for knowledge about what was going on inside. And so we asked for several things. And at the time, you know, it wasn't just here, around the country. Departments were trying to figure out what's an efficient way to share some information, what's an efficient way to gather the information. And, you know, it takes a little while to get the sea legs. So, you know, and it took a couple of weeks, but I was pleased at least to see that some of what we had asked for in our letter is now on the FDC page. You know, they have total tests now, which was something that the families had been just begging for, as Kevin referenced earlier, you know, without having any idea the numbers of tests. You know, it was all just sort of untethered and you couldn't really make sense of it. That's done now. And I've, you know, it's been a couple of weeks and maybe it should have been done earlier, but I have been impressed with some of the level of detail that they're at least trying to put on the website. Like, here are the things that we're trying to do. I think now in the latest update, they've shown that, the prisoners are going to get face masks at some point. PPE should be available for all staff at some point. These are things that, we didn't know before, but at least they're trying to say that they're out there now. I think that a lot of this, and we hear this from families all the time, I think there's a disconnect between sort of like the plan and then the implementation of the plan. And, the plan looks good, but there's just no way to know at 100+ facilities every day that it's being implemented and executed at 100%. And so a lot of times we'll hear from the families like, no, this is not happening. And you go to the website, oh, it is happening. Well, or it should be happening. There's a disconnect there. And I don't think that can be explained necessarily by, it's nefarious or it's intentional, or this is just, a lot of it is just like basic bureaucratic pathologies, right? Like it's hard to administer anything over 100+ facilities over many weeks, especially when things are churning and turning and new data and everything. So I was pleased to see that there's more out there, but I still think that they can do more in terms of transparency and keeping people informed. But I've heard from families that they're happier now that they see things like the tests, and they see that masks are coming. They see that some of this stuff is provided, at least for some of the staff who are in contact. So I'm definitely hoping for more on all of that front, but I'm pleased with what's happened so far.
Mm-hmm. Greg, are you saying that in Florida, we're testing all of our inmates?
Oh, no, not even remotely. No.
They tested 5 that they think might have been directly connected to the person that tested positive.
Yeah. No. What I meant was prior to, I think yesterday, we didn't know the total number of tests.
Right.
And now that at least has been
now.
Right. Yeah.
Now.
Okay.
And I think it's something like 0.3% of the total prison population.
Right.
And I don't know of too many states that have done this. I've only seen 4 or 5. I've seen as high as like 1.4% out in Washington. I've seen as low as 0.2 in Alabama. So I don't know whether this is consistent with national numbers, but at the very least, some number gives us a sense of, okay, total positives versus tests, whereas before you just had no idea. Right. So that's an improvement, but it's not ideal.
And just for folks to know too, according to the Tampa Bay Times, as of Tuesday afternoon, 35 inmates and 56 corrections employees have tested positive for COVID-19. But again, that's just what we know that's been tested. The point that Kevin brought up, in testing an entire dormitory likely will lead to a larger number. And I just want to highlight the point that Rep. Hart made around correctional officers as well, because I know as advocates, I know, speaking for myself, I often tend to talk about the families more because I really empathize with what they're going through. But I will say that the correctional officers are going through a lot right now as well, and their families are also scared. And we can't forget, to a point Kevin made earlier too, is both the officers and the incarcerated folks want to see improvements because it keeps everyone healthy and safe. And so we've heard concerns from COs at our office as well. Just like the hand sanitizer concern, but just concerns around, social distancing, around enough soap, around, I'm not feeling well. Why do I have to come back to work right now? Things like that. So, so we've heard.
Let me ask you about that.
Concerns.
Yeah, we're getting that question, which is there enough staff that if people are symptomatic that they can stay home, or what are they doing?
No,
there is not nearly enough staff, and we're already short anyway.
Right.
And I'd like for you all to do me a favor, if you would you write a letter to the Secretary's office? I'd like them to release the report that tells us how many officers are currently in quarantine that are not at work. I understand, and it may be a rumor, there was almost 500 officers throughout the state of Florida that were not at work. Can you imagine what a shortage that really is?
I mean, there's 24 prisons and 3 probation offices across the state that have one of these positive cases. So it wouldn't surprise me if there was a larger number of people being asked to self-quarantine just because of the spread, across the state of 24 prisons and 3 probation offices.
Yeah, and I want to address something that I think what was interesting early on at the federal and state systems, they started doing the lockdowns and shutting off visits. And I know some advocates who thought, oh, this is terrible, it's unfair to the families. The families' reaction, as always, was ahead of them, which was, no, that may protect my loved one. That may be the only form of social distancing they get. So they were okay with it, but they wanted to be able to be in touch. And what's happening is when people are locked into cells and they're not giving enough time to make phone calls, or their kiosks are broken,
Right.
or all this other stuff. And now you're looking at this lockdown extending, right? Like, so in DC, we just found out, the mayor's going to have us locked down until May 15th now. It's one thing to say 2 or 3 weeks I can go without a visit and fewer phone calls. Long term, in Italy, we saw riots and an unrest. We've seen that in a couple jails around the country because guards don't show up for work. More people are infected. The food gets paltry. I'm worried about a powder keg. And so I have you guys thought at all about that? And I don't mean to be Chicken Little. I think that's a foreseeable consequence.
I'm petrified that that's going to happen. I really am. And I keep talking to Jared and those at the secretary's office, and I'm perfectly honest with them. Listen, what I'd like you all talk about a plan. I asked them to show me a written plan. I don't want to know what your verbal plan is day to day. I want to know that you have something on paper. And I can promise you, based on talking to their correctional officers, they don't have a real plan on paper for people to follow as different things are breaking out in these facilities. They've really got to get in the front of this thing, or we're going to be in a world of trouble. And just what you say will take place.
Well, and just to add to that too, it actually was families that first contacted me through text, email, asking for visitors to be paused early on.
Yeah,
and so,
yeah.
I mean, families were very much ahead of this. They were worried that the correctional officers who are, bringing things outside, inside, families who could be doing that unintentionally. And so it's very important as lawmakers that we listen to the families who have navigated these systems for a very long time, or know it better than anyone who hasn't experienced it. And so very grateful to the families who keep in touch with us and share with us these points, because then we're able to forward that to DOC and try to get movement on it. I think there's a lot of concern, not just about not being prepared for the future and needing to provide more opportunities of health and well-being, whether it's the PPE side, but also just the emotional side and mental health side. Make sure these folks can continue to communicate with their families at a rate that is reasonable for the lack of physical visits. But I also am concerned about the private prisons in this dynamic. I'm not sure what the trend is across the country, but Blackwater, for example, where many of these cases of COVID-19 are taking place, refused to disclose any information. They instead pivoted to DMS, the Department of Management Systems, oversees the private prison contract, to answer questions to the press. So I'm also just curious about, what's the authority, right, of a private prison to withhold information compared to our traditional, state public prisons. Now the data from DOC does present the chart, and it has the prisons that are private, their cases. But it took us a long time to get there, and the private prisons were just noticeably slow and, trying to ignore the press request, using the guise as being private to delay them having to share information. So that's very concerning as well.
As I expected, we've got thousands of questions coming in. So stay with us here, and I want to get to some of these because some are being asked more than others. And Greg, I may start with you on this one, which is, people see what's happening at the federal level and they're saying, why isn't Florida just sending people to home confinement?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the lack of structures in place to do that sort of thing, right? I mean, the federal system has infrastructure and policies that the state just doesn't have. And again, it's when we set up these structures, it's for non-emergency times, right? Like,
let me drill that. Let me drill that for 1 second. When you say structures, policies, in the federal system, the Attorney General, Bureau of Prisons can send people home 10%, 6 months of their sentence, whichever is less, at the end of their sentence. And under the CARES Act, they gave him additional authority to send people for even longer. In Florida, the secretary does not have that authority, right? He can't send people to home confinement right now.
No, I mean, so we have things like work release, that, for certain subsets of the population at a certain number of months before the end of the sentence, they can qualify for work release and go and be furloughed to work release and that sort of thing. But as a general matter, we don't have halfway houses, home confinement, or any of the sorts of things that you might find in the federal system. For the enormous majority of our people, you have to serve 85%. Well, for all of them, work release can be part of that, but you serve 85% and then you max out and you're done, right? You're released. You're no longer on supervision at all for the majority of folks. So no, there is no similar mechanism to say, oh, we'll send you away for the last 6 months or whatever, or reentry. And again, there are some sort of reentry things, work release, but it's an extreme minority of cases. There just aren't that many of them relative to the prison population as a whole. And it's expensive to do those things.
And we've gotten questions about work release. So why aren't people who are in work release just being sent home at this point? Do they have to do that? Do they have to complete that? Do you guys know? Because I think there's
Unfortunately, nobody is giving anybody permission to do that. The governor could, at the stroke of his pen, decide. We did send a letter to him saying that very same thing. Why not consider folk who are on work release being released if they have been there for a long enough period of time, so that we will be able to bring some folk who are ready for work release, because we have thousands of people who are prepared for work release that for whatever reason, and I don't get it, can't seem to get there in the time they're supposed to. So I'm not quite sure what's happening here in Florida on our work release piece.
Again, I think it's really very much grounded in priorities of the governor, and the governor doesn't prioritize this, right? I mean, and there are so many issues that we were pushing the governor's office on, this being one of them, but it's like everything's a hot mess right now, right? Like the Florida's approach to every single layer of this crisis has not been clear or clean. And it's very, very frustrating to see it happen on issues that we do have structures for to some degree, to Greg's point. And it's just a reflection of whether it's prioritization or communication. But I honestly don't think that the governor is committed to these issues like many of us are. I don't think he is, because it would be easy to at least allow those that are in the workforce to be able to be at home. Absolutely. And they're almost to the end of their sentence. They are very low risk, and it would be an incredible move of justice for Florida to do that. And yet not even a comment on it. And so I'm hopeful now that, I think the pressure is being built because the transparency is happening at DOC, and that only evolved because of families being vocal, correctional officers sharing their experiences anonymously, and of course the press asking hard questions and like some serious bulldog reporting, which we need more of. Yeah. So we have to continue pushing in that direction.
Well, let's talk about the governor for a minute, because we're getting a lot of questions about that. In all these states, we work nationally, and a lot of the legislatures were going out of session just as this was hitting, just like you all, and we've seen Arizona, North Carolina, and the governor and the executive branch become the only game in town, because we asked for a special session to bring you all back to try to fix some of these problems, and that didn't happen. And so, what is it? What can people do? What pressure can be brought to bear on the governor? Because that clearly, for better or for worse, he is the only one who has authority right now to get people out, it seems.
There are people currently that are putting together phone calls. There are people emailing letters. There have been even folk who've gone to Tallahassee and driven around his house in these big parades saying, Governor, you must do something. But how do you put pressure on a man that's not a priority? We can keep saying it. I thought with the thousands of people that showed up in Tallahassee this past session, that would have been enough to put some pressure on us as legislators to do something around criminal justice reform. But hey, I'm not sure. Maybe the rep has a better way to figure this thing out. But what kind of pressure can we bring to him? Because people have been bringing it for over a year now.
Right. Folks should also remember this is the same governor that has an administration combating rights restoration right now, And so we've continued to see just a lot of discrepancies when it comes to a commitment to criminal justice reform issues long term. And so I encourage families to continue being vocal and to use different means of communication. Email, of course, but also tweet, comment on Facebook, follow him on Instagram. Like, you need to show up in all these different platforms to make sure that your issues become a priority. And of course, whenever comfortable, share your stories to larger audiences, share it to the press. We often don't talk about these issues because there is still so much stigma around the incarcerated. And I face that in my district. I'm sure Rep. Hart does as well, where you're having to really just lead on culture change, right? And move people away from this punishment approach to the law and really look at it as a public safety approach, and to help reconfigure our systems and our perceptions around what a prison is. And going to prisons as a state lawmaker is incredibly eye-opening, because it really does give the opportunity to realize that the systems are incredibly broken and corrupt and underfunded, but also the people behind these walls are people, and they're there for different reasons, but majority of them will come back to society and will live happy and full lives. And I think there's also that educational piece to teach lawmakers that, to teach the governor that. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen overnight. It does take time. And so I encourage them to continue on that path.
You guys did need us to challenge you to do this, but that's why we did the Visit a Prison Challenge, was to get more lawmakers to visit prison, not just to see the conditions, but to see the people, because it's easy to otherize people who are in prison as, not people with your concern or care. I will say that the idea of sharing stories is something FAM takes very seriously. The press reaches out to us a lot. We work with our families a lot on sharing their stories. One thing that we hear often, though, is they fear retaliation for speaking out, sometimes in the press, or sometimes even calling and nagging a case manager or the warden. What would you say about that? What is there any comfort you can give them, or what would you say?
Well, sometimes it just depends on the family and the individual. If I have somebody inside of a facility that tells me their loved one is there and they don't want their name shared, then I have to try and figure out, how do I broadly address the issue without bringing up the person's name? But I sometimes tell people, if I can't talk about it honestly, I can't help you, because I have to be able to identify some things that may be happening to you. Then what we have to do as legislators, if I put you out there, I've got to stay with you. I've got to be checking to make sure that you're not in solitary confinement, that they're not retaliating against you, because so many times when people talk to me, they are retaliated against. But I get your permission. Do I have your permission to address this as an individual? Because some people are just fed up and they want you to tell what's happening to them. So,
and with the press, a lot of times the press has, let our families speak anonymously. They don't need to share their name. They just want to be able to confirm the story, and then they'll let them speak anonymously. Rep. Escamilla, do you add anything to that?
We do. We operate the same way Rep. Hart does. When families contact us, we do our best to, if they ask us to protect their privacy, we protect their privacy. When we contact DOC, we don't use names. We try to keep it as broad as possible. I think the fear of punishment continues to be very real. When you talk to DOC about it, of course they'll say it's not something that happens in the prison. They say that all the time to us, but I think the reality of that is very different for folks who are actually in the prisons. And so I encourage folks to, contact state lawmakers, share what you feel comfortable sharing, call us, if you're not comfortable typing things, and call us. But we're definitely here to listen and help however we can. But I think what's so frustrating, for me, and I'm sure Rep. Hart, is that we're state lawmakers. We're not the executive branch. And to also explain that to everyday people, we'll leverage what we can, we'll advocate for what we can, but we're also in a different branch. And so, DOC, we fund DOC, but DOC at the end of the day is really under the governor's authority. So to make sure folks also, understand when they're advocating, who's the decision maker on this specific issue and at this specific time, and to then be compelled, to push in that direction.
Yeah, we just heard from somebody who said that their loved one, she called on behalf of her husband, and then the warden told everybody else in the facility that, this husband's spouse had called, and so then all the other guys there started giving him grief for having had his wife call. That is not a place where the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Right.
You get the whole.
Sometimes.
Well, I think if you all do it, if you complain, it's hard to be courageous when you have such a power imbalance.
It is.
And that really is, even if it's fear, it's well founded. Greg, I want to go back to you one more time on this question of Governor DeSantis and what are ways to bring pressure. I agree with the reps that if he is committed not to addressing this, then that's little, but no one wants to give up. And so they want to know what's the best way to try to weigh in and let them know. Is it, emails, calls? What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would defer to Rep. Escamani on direct action strategy. There's nobody better at that. But I mean, I think we've seen online the hashtag I care for, people coming out and sharing photos of their loved ones and explaining who they are and something special about them. I think that's powerful. I think people, the more that we can humanize the people who are incarcerated, the easier it gets to make our case. And I also think that there's just a case to be made here, right? Like, we have to make the public safety case. We have to make the case that it's reasonable that some of these folks can be released. And that, we did that in our letter to the governor, I guess it was a week ago or so, where we basically just said, as you mentioned earlier, Kevin, that it's just unreasonable to assume that the ideal number of releases given this pandemic is 0, which is where we are now. The number, and it's equally unreasonable that it's 93,000, right? Like, so we're not letting everybody out, but we shouldn't let nobody out either. The number is somewhere between those two extremes. Develop whatever criteria you believe are the appropriate criteria. Identify the people who fit the criteria, vet them as quickly as you can under whatever process you think makes sense, and then start releasing. And the other point that we made in our letter, which is equally valid, of course, is this is not a question of whether to release anyone. For a lot of these folks, the only question is, when will you release these people?
Right.
Because we let 2,500 people out every month because they finish their sentences. And so they're getting out. You can't just keep them there. So you're either going to let them out before this virus runs through the entire prison system, and therefore minimize the risk to the general public upon their inevitable release, or you're going to release them after the virus runs through the prison system and therefore increase the risk to the general public upon their inevitable release. So again, I mean, it is just astounding to me that anybody can look at the totality of this crisis and come to the conclusion that releasing nobody is the ideal solution. It just doesn't make any sense. So part of it is just making that case, and then the other part is making sure that he hears it over and over and over again from people all over the state and from stakeholders to whom he does listen.
Well, I want to just point to another resource. If you go to our page, our COVID resources page on our website, we have a research that was done by NYU, and some governors are taking action. They are drawing classes of people and looking at providing relief, either through reprieve authority, which they have. They can suspend sentences for people. Others do have more tools at their disposal, like medical clemency and the rest. But governors are acting. I mean, they are taking steps. I don't think anyone, frankly, is being as bold as they need to be to respond to this crisis. They seem to be doing as little as they can in the given moment. And then when it gets worse, then they do a little bit more. But they are acting, and they have authority, and Governor DeSantis has that same authority. So, I mean, it is not as if there's not precedent for drawing a class of people to reduce the population, whether you target sick and elderly who might be, good candidates for compassionate release, or people who are just at the end of their terms and you just want to clear them out to create more space.
Right.
How would you guys approach that? I mean, I think you guys would do both but I mean, what would be your advice on how to do it if you if you were governor?
I will say to you that I've been teaming up with my congresswoman. I have teamed up with Senator Brandis, who has just been phenomenal, who said, Rep, don't give up. I've worked with Senator Bracy. I mean, you know, it's almost like, what is it that you want us to do? The things that you are identifying as markers that you believe would help us. I look at House Bill 189, where you save $850 million over a 5-year period for folk that are nonviolent, who've not been getting in trouble. So that tells you that you have some folk in there that you could release, even if you said, I'm not gonna let my seniors go. But why would you keep the people that cost the state the most money, that's the most vulnerable, that will be dying as a result of this virus if we don't do something? So all I can say is that we continue writing, we continue calling, I'm emailing, I'm Facebook living. Only thing is now I can't go to a facility, so he can see me at the facility and talk about the facility. But you all, this is something that we've got to not forget. Even though he won't release anybody, and if you're not going to, could you please provide good medical care? Folk are dying from the lack of medical care before the virus ever even gets there. Are you all looking at the number of deaths that are occurring in our facilities throughout the state of Florida every single year? So just imagine this virus when we already have hundreds of people that are dying every day in our facilities. So that alone should be an eye-opener to our governor that something needs to be taking place. Mm-hmm. We have the worst we have the worst medical provider in the entire state of Florida. It's anywhere that I know of. Centurium should be ashamed of themselves, the way that they take care of our people now. Imagine what's going to happen when the virus really takes over.
Right. Right. And the ironic part about Centurium is how much it costs the state too. I know there's no research that even saves the state money, but it absolutely leads to people dying. And to your question, Kevin, I mean, I think you kind of outlined some strong criteria to play with. I mean, looking at folks that are near the end of their sentence, who are going to be released soon anyways, who have displayed the good behavior that that Rep. Hart mentioned in her bill. And then of course, our seniors, I mean, we have, folks, I have gotten emails from constituents who have loved ones that are like in their 80s now, incarcerated, and they're very fearful for the end of their life because COVID-19, obviously has huge consequences for at-risk populations, including our seniors. And so I do think those are the two categories that would be looked at first. But the fact that there's not even a conversation is quite disheartening.
Yeah, we're gonna wrap up. There's only 300 questions in the queue, just so you know, 300 more questions and comments, which I don't think we're gonna sneak in these last 3 minutes. First of all, I gotta thank you so much. This has been great. We definitely could have gone a lot longer. If we always tell people, and I'll say it now, if we didn't get to your question, and if it's in the comments, our staff will try to come and answer it as best you can. I invite both of you to come to our Facebook page, and you'll see questions that you may want to be able to answer. Sure. I am a big believer, Greg is too, as I'm sure you've seen, of Twitter, not because I love it, but because I think the people we need to reach are there. And right. You both are there. So how can people get in touch with you and follow what you're doing and cheer you along? What's the best way? For
me, it's Diane Hart. That's my Facebook page. I also have a state rep page. It's called Representative Diane Hart. At Florida FL, Diane Hart. Everything is just my name. For Twitter, for Facebook, for Instagram. So you wouldn't have to look too hard for me. But you can reach me also at my district office at 813-224-1956 or at diane.hart@myfloridahouse.gov. You will find me. Or my cell phone, 813-748-0952. I'm always available. People are amazed that I answer the phone myself.
Jeez Louise.
I don't even get out my cell phone.
You're courageous. Okay, yes, Kamani.
And you can find me on any of the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Anna for Florida, all spelled out with 2 N's. So it's at Anna for Florida. If you do email us, anna.escamani@myfloridahouse.gov, much like Rep Hart, my email pops up with my cell phone number in case you do need an urgent call. And many families do text us as well as call us.
Amazing. That's servant leadership that you're so available, and we appreciate that. Greg, do you want to say anything before I close?
Well, probably 1,000 things, but we don't have time for most of them. But I did want to just say thank you to the reps for taking the time. They are unbelievably busy right now and answering hundreds of constituent messages all the time, whether it's unemployment or anything like that. So taking an hour, I want everybody who's watching this now or in the future or in the comment section to understand what it means for these two to take an hour out of their day to come talk to you is unbelievable. And thank you so much. And if there's anything we can do for you, just give us a call.
Yes, I want to echo that. And I'm going to close with my usual closing, which is to say, in addition to thank you to the families who are watching and advocating for your loved ones, self-care is not just a slogan. It's really important. And so while you fight hard, fight smart, take care of yourselves. There's only so much you can do. The FAM staff feels what you're going through intensely, because we're hearing from thousands of you every day, and it's hard not to take on your anxiety, and we are. It also fuels us and gives us passion to keep fighting for you. But there's only so much you can do. And your loved one who is behind bars is taking care of themselves to the best of their ability. They would not want you to worry about them 24/7. They want you to be present for your family members on the outside and your neighbors and loved ones who need you. So please follow along with us. Take action. Do as much as you can each day, and then put it aside and give yourself a break and take care of yourself, because this is going to be a long fight, and it's not going to end when this pandemic passes. We have a lot of work to do. So thank you for your advocacy, and take care of yourself, and we will see you on our next Facebook Live. So thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.